The chandeliers puddled light like molten silver over the ballroom. Each crystal refracted a world of gowns and polished shoes, of laughter that had been practiced until it sounded effortless. From the balcony, where the orchestra had just swelled into the refrain that meant champagne would be poured and photographs would be taken, Emily stood against the plaster balustrade and felt like an intruder in a painting. She had been there for 20 minutes, balancing a tray that vibrated against the hollow of her wrist, pretending the apron around her waist did not hum with the ache of her own small life. Waitressing at charity galas was a good gig for a weekend. Tips were generous, the food was decent, and the leftovers, those unclaimed tiny desserts, kept her mother away from the more expensive vending machines. Tonight, she had worked 3 doubles to cover a month's pile of medical notices that had arrived in a shabby envelope pink with her mother's name. The hospital had sent what hospitals sent, polite letters that read like arithmetic and judgment. Someone bumped her elbow, her tray rocked. A waiter in a tux behind her steadied it with a muttered apology, but not before a low line of creme brulee slid and smeared across the edge of her palm. The burn stung, but the humiliation was sharper, the kind that sat in the throat. She laughed it off. She always maffed. Smiles earned more tips than tearful explanations. Across the room, a man stood with a glass held like a prop. He was not the kind who laughed with anyone. He listened and made the room rearrange itself around him. His suit was a cut of dark that ate light. His hands were large and precise. People noticed him because he seemed not to notice them, and because everything about him was quietly complete. Henry Montgomery had the look of consequence. He had the look of the sort of man who made others alter their walks without meaning to. The Montgomery name had been in the society column for as long as Emily had been alive. It had built hospitals and scholarships and museums and had moved money in ways no ledger ever printed. A woman in a gown that had its own climate, too pale by intent, jewels sharp as legal briefs, reached out as Emily passed. The woman's smile was a blade with velvet wrapped around it. "Oh, darling, watch your step," she said, not to Emily, but about her. "The help tends to be slippery at these events. So clumsy, aren't they?" The laugh that followed was a string of small knives. People arranged themselves into a kind of obedient chorus. Emily heard the pitch of disdain and felt it like a physical draft. Her jaw tightened. She had walked through worse, grocery store faces that told stories of appearances and last names, but this was close, a heat against the small, ever-repairing place in her chest. Before Emily could stammer an apology, the man in the dark moved. He stepped between her and the woman as if his shoulder had a hinge for cutting off insults. He did not raise his voice. He did not smile. He put his hand at the small of her back with a single, efficient motion and said to the room, low and easily audible, "Miss, tonight I believe this woman is my wife." A hush ran like a ripple across the polished floors. The orchestra strings gave way. Conversations hit a wall and held their breath. Emily's weight shifted so abruptly she nearly dropped the tray. Heat flooded her ears, then her face. She was married. The word did not compute with the apron. It clanged against her like a coin dropped into a stranger's fountain. The woman with the jewels paled. The expression that had been smirking turned into a fragile, indignant animal. The room reassembled, this time to the tune of possibility and attention. Henry kept his hand at the small of her back until a waiter took the tray. His voice was a velvet guillotine, impossible to resist and impossible to argue with. "We're late for the carriage," he murmured, as though the statement were an unexceptional fact and not an invention that rearranged Emily's life. She had not agreed to be his wife. She had not even known his name. Yet the way he said it made it feel true. People around them began to whisper, to fill the vacuum with 1,000 stories. Photographers angled. Some patrons leaned closer, as if proximity might snag a bit of the narrative magic for themselves. Someone behind Emily hissed, "Is she his?" And a man at the periphery murmured, "Montgomery." He escorted her to the far edge of the ballroom like a cat moving a fragile prize. His palm remained at her back, steady and cool. When the door to the outer hallway closed, his fingers loosened. They stood under the spill of a softer chandelier. He looked at her then with eyes that had been measured in the same room and found her wanting. Not in a dismissive way, but as someone catalogued for later decisions. "Leave them to presume," he said. There was a faint clinical amusement beneath his words. "You handled that without breaking anything." "My hand's on fire," she said, because her mouth felt as unlikely as her skin. The burn tasted of sugar and iron and the memory of a cheap pack of matches. He produced a small leather card from his jacket with fingers that folded like someone used to holding exact change. He did not hand it to her. He placed it flat on the banister, edge parallel as if he had set down a piece of glass. On it, in an indifferent font, was his number, his name, and the name that meant the world around him, Montgomery. "If you ever need anything," he began. "I'm not supposed to take charity," she interrupted, before she could sound like someone who could, which she often did by accident. The word charity scraped. Money was not the only thing that felt like charity. Attention felt like it too, and that was the more dangerous kind. He lifted his chin then, the hint of a map being read. "This isn't charity." "You just made me your wife," she said. Her voice had a tremble now, unsteady with absurdity and the strange thwack of adrenaline. He looked at her as if choosing a new book from a shelf. "No," he corrected. "I suggested for the evening. I can offer more than suggestion, Miss Scott." He had not learned her name from anywhere but the way people had called waitresses tonight. Emily, another plate. But his correction made her name feel like the hinge of a door. She wanted to demand how he could possibly make such offers. She wanted to laugh or to push him against the wall. Instead, she accepted the absurdity the way one accepts a storm, tidy it, cover the room, and wait it out. The card was there on the banister when she left. So was a whisper in her ear, a voice that had been low as a promise. "If you ever need anything, call." She returned to the diner before dawn. The fluorescent lights were honest. They did not flatter. They revealed the grease at the corner of the grill, the staff who rubbed their eyes with the back of their hands, the pile of envelopes waiting for an evening-long translation into numbers. The tray stains on her palm had turned into a ribbon of scarlet that throbbed with the memory of sugar. Her mother's bills were stacked like a small, accusing library on the table, and when Emily sat, they threatened to topple. Her mother, Joan, slept in the guest chair with the multicolored blanket they could afford because it had been a discount. Her chest rose and fell on a schedule of machines and medications. Emily had learned the language of care with the patience of someone who had no alternative. She had learned to ask pharmacists for more time, to make hospitals accept installment plans like they were favors to someone else's child. She had learned to be small. As she made coffee, as she moved with the practiced economy of someone who could set a kitchen for 3 people with 2 hands and a sigh, she thought of the card in her apron. Henry Montgomery's name felt like a coin. She bunched the paper into her fist, imagining every possible way it could buy oxygen or tests or more time. She thought of the way he had protected her with a declaration that had been both a lie and a lifeline. A week passed like that, shifts and a skeleton of private moments, where she read medical forums and made lists of what to pay and when. The card lived in the back pocket of her denim, like a secret seed. She carried the memory of his hand at her back, as if it were a different architecture. Someone had held her and reshaped the cartilage of her world for the span of an evening. It was a courtesy she did not know how to return. The call came the following Thursday. She answered with an apology ready in her throat. Emily Scott. His voice did not carry a name through the phone. It cut, tissue-thin, precise. He invited her to meet at a cafe, halfway between the hospital and the line of town they called the Better Half. She almost told him no. She almost hung up because Better Half was not hers, and she had learned the value of staying invisible in such places. But the bills rustled, and the word philanthropy had been tossed in the same breath with Montgomery when she looked him up in the newspaper between shifts, and philanthropy translated to access in the language she had been taught to read. They chose a neutral place, a plain cafe whose windows fogged in breath and steam. He arrived with the same slow certainty he had shown that night. He did not sit until she had placed both feet on the floor and arranged the receipt-stained napkin between them like a small white flag. "You told me I wasn't to take charity," he said, as if reciting something from a file. "You told me to leave them to presume," she returned. She had no armor for this conversation. She had only the rawness of a person forcing the world to add up. "You should read this," he said, and he began to explain what sounded like a professional offer, but was, underneath, something older and more dangerous. He offered a way to pay the debt. He offered security. He offered a job with a title that had none of the usual name tags. He offered what his world could make: discreet transfers, private clinics, caregivers who did not need to be asked twice. He offered protection. He offered, precisely and without flourish, a contract. Her laugh when it came sounded like something torn from the body. "I don't sign things for people whose names are in the society pages." He put a gray folder on the table like a single-stroke painting. The paper inside was thick and clean. The first few pages were the kind of legal frankness Emily had only seen on the backs of bank statements: amounts, dates, arrangements. The language smoothed itself into promises. He spoke without looking at her. A year's term, public appearances, galas, fundraisers, official events. You will represent the family at the venues that matter. You will attend dinners, you will smile when prompted, you will meet certain people. The family will take care of your mother's medical needs entirely and set aside a trust to cover future expenses beyond this year. A trust? Emily's fingers fumbled. Her mind kept skidding around images: an envelope with money, a doctor who would finally stop speaking of numbers as threats, a day when her mother would laugh without the drip of fear. She thought, briefly, of accepting the offer with the same calm calculation she used to work double shifts. This would get them out. "And you want me to lie," she said. He lifted his eyes then, and for the first time she saw something that was not a mask, but a mechanism. There was a wound that had taught him how to pronounce necessity. To the public, yes, no one need know specifics. To the family, we will introduce you. She understood the word introduce. In his world, being introduced was being adopted, archived, labeled. She had no illusions about what that might cost. The folder was not made for her. It was drafted to be read and then, if accepted, folded into other apartments and curated photographs. Yet it sat between them like a door, and the other side smelled of oxygen. "You'll have privacy," he said, quick as someone trying to hand a bandage before the cut bled through. "You will have autonomy in your private life. You will live in a separate wing, your own quarters, staff, hours. You will not be expected to perform between midnight and 4 in the morning." His voice was almost wry. "Unless you choose to." She blinked, surprised by the odd tenderness of that last clause. It made everything smaller, more precise. It made it negotiable. She read the contract twice before she let her fingers trace the top line. And then she found Article 11. It was not a flourish or a trinket in the margins. It was a blade in the center of the legal body, plainly named Emotional Attachment Termination Clause. Article 11 demanded that if either party admitted to experiencing genuine romantic feelings toward the other, declaration defined as a verbal confession witnessed by counsel or an incontrovertible written statement, then their contractual relationship would terminate immediately. Benefits would cease, trusts would be frozen pending arbitration, and all public ties would be ended with a financial severance calculated to ensure no lingering legal entanglement. Her stomach dropped. The clause read like an ultimatum shaped into the grammar of a prenuptial agreement. It was not only a warning, it was a boundary that had been weaponized. She had seen prenuptials in glossy magazines, the lines sealed with gold and ink. This was the opposite. Hairline fractures made law. "Why is that in here?" she asked. Her voice was small against the cafe's low hum. He did not flinch. He had always measured his intentions with the same steady caution he now exhibited in the angle of his wrist. Because feelings, once vocalized, complicate arrangements that are meant to be transactional. The phrase sounded clinical. He might have been describing a mathematical anomaly. Because it prevents entanglement. Because I cannot afford the personal to contaminate the professional. "You don't want anyone to know how you feel," she said instead, letting the accusation sound feather-light. He considered her then, close enough that she could see the way the skin at his temples held. There were no tremors but a tremor-shaped absence. Correct. Emily folded the page softly, like closing a lid. The pages smelled like expensive paper and old secrets. She had not read a clause like Article 11 before. It felt like being given a map whose lines were drawn in acid. Every instinct told her to refuse a man who might be dangerous to cross. She remembered, however, the ambulance receipts and the voicemail from an oncology nurse whose voice had a tired candor. She remembered the nights she had rationed cold soup. She remembered her mother coughing and pretending it was only a tickle. The contract was a bridge. The clause was a warning sign on that bridge. There was almost nothing in her life these days that did not come with a warning sign. "How long?" she asked. 1 year, he said. Full coverage for medical expenses incurred during that time, and the establishment of a trust to cover ongoing care after the year if necessary. Severance provisions in case of termination that would secure alternative arrangements for your mother. He did not speak of the network strings, of how the Montgomery name could navigate a bureaucracy. He spoke only of figures and safeties and the architecture of a legal promise. There was a certain ruthlessness to the clarity that made her dizzy. She thought of her mother awake in the chair with the blanket, how she hummed when she slept, how she had a habit of folding her hands like she was saving space for herself. She thought of being able to fix her mother's pillow without counting pennies. Emily set her pen down. Her decision did not feel like anything noble. It felt like a transaction made under duress of loving someone who was not to blame. "All right," she said, and the single syllable sounded like surrender and strategy at once. The pen scratched through loops of words. She signed in a cramped script that had been practiced for rent agreements and library cards. Henry watched the stroke of her hand with an interest so absolute it bordered on reverence. He held the pen back for a moment like someone reluctant to close a book. "You will need to understand terms," he said, and placed his fingers on the top of her knuckles in what might have been comfort and might have been occupation. "Your public role will be rehearsed. You will attend events. You will accept introductions. You will not—" He paused, searching for phrasing that was both blunt and oddly kind. "Play with power, simply because you have been granted access to it." Emily had sat across from men and women who assumed access was a birthright. She had not wanted that for herself. Yet the promise of stability was a bright, white thing she had not touched in years. A team moved around her, lawyers with voices like measured clocks, a woman who would become her liaison and who had pamphlets for etiquette and glossed photographs. Henry himself oversaw such transactions like a surgeon. Each move was precise, stripped of flourish, executed with the efficiency of someone who had practiced crisis as a language. The world unfurled into preparation. Emily's life, in the span of days, became a montage of small, disorienting things. A stylist who smelled like citrus and prom plans taught her to let a dress fall rather than cling. A trainer at a private gym gave her lessons in standing straight without looking defensive. Photographers practiced catching smiles that could be cataloged and reused. She learned not to interrupt at the wrong moment. She learned the degree of tilt necessary for a perfect laugh.
She moved into an apartment inside Henry's building, a wing that was hers but still breathed the house's architecture. The staff called her Miss Scott with an economy of syllables that felt like a new grammar. Her quarters were furnished with soft light and glass, with a view that reversed the city into a miniature diorama at night. There was a separate entrance, a private corridor, a ring of staff names she did not have to memorize. The bed linens were soft enough to make shame feel like a foreign load for a single night. But magnitude did not change the core of her worries. The bills were settled, the trust stamped and made real, yet Article 11 hovered like a weather system. She felt it in the way Henry's eyes softened and then tightened when they spoke of private things. She felt it in the micro-silences that had heft, in the way he would place a hand at the small of her back and then draw it away like a professional undoing a suture. There were small kindnesses that were not false. Soup left on her door when she came down with a fever. A handkerchief pressed into her palm when a spell of weakness had her gripping railings. A recorded message of care left on her phone that was the same message he left 100 men. These things were curated. They were also real. The life Emily had signed for was public by definition. She practiced smiles like a short script. She learned the difference between being seen and being known. She became a polished object in an environment that demanded presentation. The public imagined her as a new Mrs. Montgomery, an iteration on what a wife in those rooms was supposed to be: curated, photogenic, politically convenient. Henry watched her learning with a concentration that was almost haptic. He had rules in place: separate rooms, professional distance, respect for privacy. He also had a way of looking at things that made them more vivid. He found margins and made them contained. When she cooked amateur meals in a borrowed kitchenette, he would occasionally sample a spoonful and close his eyes with a precise approval. When she told a joke during a rehearsal dinner, he would let himself be amused. Small, guarded amusement, like light escaping through a cracked wall. They were both performing different kinds of survival. She knew she had to protect the life she had chosen to save. He had reasons to hold himself back: family history, a lineage where entanglement had been punished with ruin. His business, never named in blunt terms, loomed like a shadow in the way others referred to him as capable of erasing trouble by convincing institutions it had never been there. He was a myth to outsiders and a calculus to insiders. He presented himself as a philanthropist first, a protector second. Beneath that surface was the tacit knowledge that he moved in a world where consequences were not always entangled in legalese. Their boundaries were mechanical. Article 11 was a cold line in their document. Yet the life between them was not all metal and law. There were small, accidental moments of improvised intimacy. An unplanned laugh in the library, the way he would steady her when she stood too long on a skyscraper's edge and the wind tried to correct her. She found herself waking to a house that had, over the course of weeks, become a place where weather and light changed from being simply aesthetic to being anchors. One night, while rain etched the window like a scratch of cords, she fell ill. Fever burned under her skin and made her cheeks glow as if lit from within. Toward midnight, she staggered out of bed, thirsty and fever-soft, and found a metal tray balanced on the bedside table: soup, a thermometer, a clean handkerchief folded like an apology. There was a note in handwriting she had not yet learned to call his. It said, simply, "If you need anything, press the second button on the nightstand." The second button summoned a silence and a person who already knew the arc of how to take care. Henry arrived without announcement and without fanfare. He did not hover. He closed the bedroom door and took a seat in the chair opposite her bed. His hands folded with a prudence that could have been ceremony. He watched her with a tension that was almost a hold. "Drink," he told her when she clutched the spoon and couldn't coordinate the motion. It was not an ordinary command. It was a specificity that had been distilled from a lifetime of being a man used to giving orders that could create outcomes. She drank. He checked the thermometer with a practiced, clinical motion that made her think of surgeons and of men who kept their hands clean. "You need bed rest," he said. "No appearances for 3 days." She laughed, a wet sound. "Since when do I have caretakers?"
"Since you signed the contract," he replied. The words had a funny, literal quality. "Since the family became responsible." She watched him then, high fever and low wit, and saw something small crumbling in the wall around him. He was not suddenly sentimental. He simply paused with an honesty that was almost frightening. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Because there was a version of his deflection she wanted ripped open. "Why rescue me in the ballroom? Why go to the trouble?" He sat, and the room shrank to the circumference of his patience. "Because you were there," he said. It was not an answer he would have expected to surrender. Because when you were held like that, awkward and entirely exposed, you did not beg or over-explain. You did not apologize for existing. The thought lodged in her throat. No one had ever told her that without a sales pitch or a barbed compliment. He watched her take in the confession like a measured experiment. "I do not do rescue as a hobby," he added, almost with irritation. "But discretion is valuable. Tonight, I used it." She slept after that, fever finally sliding into something that was merely weak. When she woke, sunlight filtered across the bed and left a barcode of brightness on the floor. The tray was gone. The note had been removed. The house smelled faintly of lemon and something she couldn't name, the scent of a place regularly cleaned and cared for. The months that followed fell into a rhythm. There were events where she learned how to inhabit a gown and even how to hold a conversation about philanthropy without speaking as if she wanted to pick the room apart. There were afternoons when she would sit in the company's library and watch Henry read with a diligence that was almost worshipful. She was not blind to the performance. She had vowed to be a professional. Yet the seams between the performance and the real began to blur in ways she had not anticipated. A small hand at the small of her back that felt less like occupation and more like something she could lean into. A touch that was a punctuation mark and then was something like conversation. Still, Article 11 was a steady, chilling instrument. It whispered like a draft every time Henry's eyes softened. She learned the art of saying nothing at the right moment. He learned the art of telling her exactly what he would do for her without words, personal as they might have been, twist into confessions. There were nights when loneliness crawled into their separate wings. They had dinners that were mutual performances, and mornings when their conversations scraped the bottom of the acceptable. They kept their lives neat because their lives had to be neat. The Montgomery name liked clean edges and solvable problems. Love, in all its ruinous irrationality, had a way of breaking things open that the house was not built to contain. It was on an ordinary Thursday, one of those days that was a collage of teaspoons and small anxieties, when a headline slipped into Emily's phone like an oyster shell that had been hammered open. Catherine Sterling Exposé. The name meant nothing to Emily until she saw the photograph beneath it. A woman with a smile like a weapon, Henry's former wife, bleeding her story into a serial column that smelled of betrayal and profit. The article promised details and fortunes. It implied things about Henry's past that were black and huge and impossible to placate. Emily read the excerpt twice, then a third time, because the words rattled like hail against a fragile roof. It was not only the accusations, it was the publicness of it. It announced cracks she had not known existed. She felt suddenly that everything they had built on top of cleanliness might be scraped away by a sentence. She confronted Henry in the study that night. He had not been surprised to find her sitting in the shadow of the bookshelves with the phone in her hand. He had not been surprised because nothing in his life existed outside anticipation. "You read it," he said, as if the statement were a fact drawn on a court calendar. His voice made her think of cold metal. "I did," she answered, though she had been ready to deny it. It felt important to be honest in this moment, because Article 11 had the curious effect of demanding transparency in the very act of forbidding certain truths. "Do you—" She stopped. How did one ask whether the thing written about one was true? It felt like asking whether a wound had been real. He closed his eyes then, for the first time she had seen as anything but calculation.
When he opened them, they were steady. "Ignore her," he said simply, and the simplicity was both a balm and a threat. It suggested power, but not without price. She bristled. "Ignore it? People will ask questions. They will talk. They'll look at me and see dirt where before there was only a dress." He stood then, the movement something of a ritual. He crossed to her and, with a deliberation she had begun to dread and yet long for, cupped her face. The touch was gentle, fingers warm like the inside of a hand that had not known much softness. "Tell me," he whispered, "if you are." He would not say the words. He did not need to. Article 11 would take anything spoken like that and turn it into a mechanism. She thought of the clause and felt the air around it contract. "You would enforce it," she said instead. He did not answer in words. He did not need to. He looked like a man who had made and remade rules to keep the world a manageable shape. In the silence, she felt the full force of what she had signed for, protection tethered to a law that feared the messiness of affection. Their hands met and did not pass into anything beyond the touch. There was friction and a small mutual understanding that they were walking a thin rope made of ink and risk. She left the study that night with the taste of iron in her mouth and the echo of his almost question in her ear. There were consequences to living in a world where secrets could be bought and spun and then discarded at will. Emily began to tally the public responses to the article like a ledger. Sideways glances at Gala entries, a photographer angling for a picture that would sell copies, a whispered rumor that a marriage, if it was a marriage at all, was a business decision in the worst sense. Her own performance that week felt like a sieve with holes that allowed in gossip and cold air. And yet, as the days tightened like a coil, Emily found an odd, stubborn resilience in herself. She had been given something that would save her mother. She had given away a small portion of her freedom in exchange for that safety. The trade felt necessary and also like an infringement. She navigated the duality like someone walking between two lanes of traffic. Head down, eyes up, always listening. Without warning, there came a moment in the study where Henry reached for her with a kind of grief that had been new, quiet, accidental, and impossible to outlaw retroactively. He kissed her then, not a cinematic, orchestrated thing, but a kiss of desperation, of a man who had just been stripped of another kind of facade and was trying to hold on to the rawness he had been taught to avoid. It was brief and heavy and claimed. When he pulled away, the confession that had not been spoken hung in the air like a threat. The reaction was immediate and ugly. The two of them knew what Article 11 demanded. He looked at her with a mixture of shame and fury at himself, which was perhaps the most honest expression she'd ever seen on his face. "You know what that means," he said, voice gone small in the large room. His hands were fists at his sides. She nodded, because to deny it would be to deny the contract she had signed, and to deny that she had meant, in private and without legal witness, to feel something that might unravel what she had secured for her mother. He did not need to consult counsel to enforce the clause. The mechanism was clear, and his enforcement would be equal parts legal and personal. That night, the house had the sound of a lidded box being closed. She slept on a separate couch. The house rearranged itself into distance. A week later, formal notice arrived. Henry had followed the letter, as he always did. Article 11 had been invoked by his counsel on the grounds of a declaration he had made in the study. The termination clause snapped like a trap. Benefits would cease. The trust would be frozen pending arbitration. Severance would be calculated. The edges of Emily's newly purchased stability were serrated and raw again. She thought at first to leave, not to run, but to remove herself from the architecture she had allowed to be built around her. She saw, in the act of stepping away, the possibility of being free of a contract that had both protected and constrained her. Freedom had its own hunger and its own costs. At 3 in the morning, when the city kept a wary silence and rain had started to write new maps across the windows, Emily packed a bag with the economy of a person who had always packed for loss. She left the penthouse into a night that smelled like rain and smoke and possibility, and when she reached the corner, where cabs lined like patient beasts, she found Henry standing as if waiting for her. He did not speak at first. He held a plane ticket in his hand, simple and unadorned. There was also an envelope, thick, the kind used for bank transfers, the kind that crinkled like a promise. He offered both with the nonchalance of a man offering someone a door. "You can leave," he said. "Go anywhere. The trust will be released if you go. The severance will secure a life for your mother. I will not stop you." There was something in the way he said it that was not freedom at all. It was a way of absolving himself by creating escape. She looked at the options, at the plane ticket's destination, neutral, unremarkable. She looked then at the envelope and what it might contain. She thought of her mother asleep in a chair with the colorful blanket and the way her breath sounded like counting. "I could leave," she said, because she had to test whether the world had become hers to command, or whether it would always be offered as a choice with teeth. He shook his head, a small, fierce motion. "No," he said, "you could leave, but I will not make you. I will not force you. This is your choice." She remembered Article 11 like a brand. She remembered his kiss like a confession. She remembered the way he had guarded his heart as one might guard a secret weapon. She also remembered nights when he had stayed quiet while she cried on the phone outside of hospital doors at 3 in the morning. She remembered a man who had protected her in the ballroom because he had been annoyed by cruelty. She took a breath that tasted like cold rain and made a choice that would not be simple. She did not take the plane ticket. She did not walk out. She stepped back toward the building as if towards a test. Henry watched her with an expression that had finally been pried open into something like fear. "I'll stay," she said. The words were small but meant. They were not a plea or a compromise. They were an arrangement made in blood and bargaining, but on my terms. He laughed then, briefly, something that was almost like relief and almost like terror, and held out his hand. She took it, and the city light took them both into a frame that was not yet resolved. If you love enemies to lovers with high stakes, tap subscribe. They signed new paperwork that night, after the tempest and before the day peeled itself open. The termination had been rescinded only if the parties agreed to a new set of stipulations. The legal woman who had become her liaison sat in the corner with a pencil and a list of do's and don'ts. Henry adjusted clauses like a man who had carved his life into stone. Emily read each line not simply with the eyes that had been taught to balance bills, but with a new, curious kind of attention. She negotiated items that felt like small acts of autonomy, vacations that did not require approval, a clause about privacy that kept certain rooms off limits to the family, and, most importantly, a revision to the conditions around Article 11. It remained because he insisted on it. He could not, he said, allow its absence. But they agreed on a process, one that required mediation rather than immediate termination, a buffer that would allow them the dignity of addressing the mess that feelings made without a catalog of public punishments. Henry did not give up the clause entirely. He reframed it. Confession would not automatically sever the contract if both parties agreed to mediation and a cooling period. He argued for safety and contingency, language foreign to raw love and essential to his architecture. Emily insisted on provisions that protected her mother regardless of the contract's life. When the ink dried, it felt less like ink and more like a lattice, something you could climb or fall from, depending on the choices you made. For a moment, they stood over the papers like people who had just been given a map in a language only half known. They had both asked for what they could not wholly give themselves. They had both kept something. That night, after the lawyers left and the city hummed, Henry opened his mouth and said, quietly, "I don't like losing control." The sentence was not an admission of weakness as much as a factual report. Emily watched him then and saw the truth in it. He had built walls against intimacy because intimacy had the capacity to undo the structures he had made to protect people in his circle. It was, in its way, sensible. It was, in its agony, human. "I don't like being required to lie either," she said, and the admission was a small, defiant flame. She had lied in the ballroom. She had performed survival. She had also tried, in the month since, to be honest enough to not drown in her own concealments. For all the plans and clauses and secrecy, there remained a simple fact. Both of them had been changed by the single whisper that had started it all. They moved through the house now as two halves of a machine being tested. They were not, by any definition, in love. If anything, they had been arranged into proximity where affection could bud, like a plant set under glass. Neither wanted to name it. Naming would invite Article 11 like a specter. The first part of their story settled into place: rescue, contract, private concessions, and the beginning of something that was neither fully a lie nor fully an affection. They had made their bargains. They had kept their distance. They had policies for each other's failings and boundaries mapped like emergency exits. The city offered them no respite. Headlines simmered just below the surface. Catherine Sterling's words continued to feed gossip. The public imagined narratives and dressed them up like costumes. In private, however, the house kept edges blunt, and the nights turned into a new kind of practice, learning how to be tender within protocols. The stage had been set. The contract, Article 11, hung like a clock in each room, an instrument that marked time and threat in equal measure. They had settled into their roles, but roles have a way of leaking truth through the seams. At the center of the house, in a room lined with books and a fireplace that never quite warmed everything, Henry left an embossed napkin in the middle of a table one morning without comment. It was an odd domestic thing in a house that measured life in auctions and announcements. Emily found it when she rose and poured coffee, the napkin folded into a rectangle like a little blank treaty. On the napkin, in a handwriting neither of them used for anything more public than a grocery list or a reminder, someone had scrawled a single, impossibly simple question: "Come to Florence with me." Emily stared at the quick loop of letters for longer than necessary. The napkin sat in the center of the breakfast tray like a tiny treaty, its edges soaked with the ghost of coffee. She turned it over, half expecting a signature, an office stamp, anything to make the invitation less personal, less precarious. There was nothing. Whoever had written it hadn't bothered with ceremony. She felt the old reflex to measure risk, to run numbers the way she measured bills: airfare, the months of care already promised, the trust that hummed like a generator in the background. Florence wasn't a whim. It was the kind of image the Montgomery name used to place itself in glossy magazines, a photographable piece of patronage, a PR trip, a weekend that would be spun into charity and culture. But the handwriting, quick and unembellished, felt like a private chord pressed under the public melody. She went to the mirror that morning and pushed her hair back the way she had been taught in fittings, not too much, not too little. Henry's team would be overseeing every frame of the trip, and she had learned that the cameras wanted neat stories. There was, she also realized, a private reason to go. Florence was a place that had always sounded like a dream she could not afford. Gelato, bridges, light that made strangers look as if they'd been painted into being. All of it seemed unnecessarily beautiful for someone who kept the names of medications in a small book on the kitchen table. When she told him, he did not blink. His reaction was the kind that had become familiar, a slow calibration, an appraisal that arrived at decisions with surgical neatness. "We travel Thursday," he said. 2 nights. A photographer will accompany us. There will be staged appearances at the Museo and the Piazza. Avoid long sleeves at the luncheon. Wear something that reads understated ease. There was the contract language behind everything, plans, logistics, contingency. But under it pulsed an interpersonal current she could not ignore. He wanted her there. For reasons both public and private, Florence would be the moment the family could present her as part of its public face. For them, for her, for the cameras, it would be choreography. She spent the week before the trip in a flurry of fittings and briefings, but also small, secretive moments. A florist who taught her to tuck sprigs of olive leaves into a bouquet. A silent rehearsal with the photographer about where to stand so light could find the face that had learned to look modest. Henry observed from the edges, like a man cataloging how the world corrected itself around his decisions. Sometimes, in the privacy of the car, he would reach out and touch the top of her hand, not a possessive claim, but a punctuation. Here. Florence was everything people promised. The air there cut with a kind of honest sun that made skin look like a confession. They arrived by private jet, a quiet arc from the city that felt like dropping into a fable. When she stepped onto cobblestones that had been walked by centuries, she felt at once fragile and incorrigible, an odd mix that made her heart quicken without warning. Their days were an arrangement of light and image. A morning at a museum where the photographer asked her to look, briefly, as if she had found something only she could see. An afternoon in a piazza where a violinist played under a terrace and people stopped to photograph them because the sight of a Montgomery with a woman who had once held a tray in a ballroom was exactly the kind of story editors like to run. They ate gelato beside the river, and Henry let himself be clumsy with a cone in a way he rarely permitted himself in private rooms. He laughed, short and controlled, and Emily found she was collecting those laughs like contraband. The hike to a small viewpoint outside the city was not on the schedule. It was the kind of unscripted addition that had only the hint of an excuse behind it. Henry suggested the walk as if following a map, as if his own curiosity were an itinerary. They walked through olive groves and old stone, their footsteps private on the path, and for hours the cameras were forgotten. At dusk, they paused on a small bridge that arched over the Arno, and the city took a breath. Street lamps unfurled like small constellations. The violinist down below had moved closer and played a piece that made Emily's chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with the trust or the contract. They were alone in a way that felt less like privacy and more like a private performance. Henry stepped closer. He did not say anything. He had the habit of letting the more dangerous sentences remain unsaid until they clamored, like moths, for the light. His hand found the small of her back in a way that was no longer the corrective touch of a man orchestrating a room. It was a placement of intent. The space between them contracted. He inhaled, and she could see the shape of a decision forming in him. "Don't," he whispered suddenly, not as a prohibition, but as a plea, a request not to break the line they had both agreed to keep. Not now. She closed her eyes. It felt like the nearest thing to truth. They were balancing on an edge. The near kiss was alive in her fingertips, an immediate gravity that threatened Article 11 like thunderclouds. She did not lean in. She did not pull away. She let the moment be what it was, luminous and dangerous, a photograph that had nearly been taken, but hadn't. They returned to the choreography of public life a little more intimately threaded for the quiet. The trip gave them each a private ledger of small exchanges. The way he would hold her scarf when the wind wanted to claim it. The way she would route their traffic of conversation around subjects she knew would make him harden. Florence softened them both in its way. Its beauty worked like a solvent on the carefully arranged edges of their daily performance. When they landed home, there was a sense that something had shifted. Not everything changed. Contracts, suits, staff, the persistent hum of the family presence, those remained. But in quiet corners, where the house's temperature dropped to allow for honest breath, Henry's hand no longer retreated so quickly. Her own defenses, carved from months of small humiliations and necessary economizing, grew thin in the warm, rare light of his attention. Then Catherine Sterling published a second excerpt. The first time Catherine's name had appeared on Emily's phone the year before, it had been a hailstorm. A column, a smear, a public brush with history. This new piece was worse because it arrived not as a single article, but as a cascade. Clips, audio bites, a serialized online series that promised more private details and insinuations. Catherine had always been sharp. Now she was crucible hot. She suggested, in paragraphs that were designed to be retweeted, that Henry had used Emily as part of a bargain, that the marriage was a transaction, and Emily nothing more than a well-timed exhibit. The reaction was immediate. The photographers who had once angled for soft shots now lurked. A pundit on a morning broadcast read lines from the excerpt as if performing an autopsy. DMs and comments, both venomous and solicitous, multiplied like an infestation. Emily watched the world tilt around them the way one watches a pot come to boil, the expectation of overflow inevitable and imminent. Henry was quiet at first, his silence a shudder of containment. He tightened public plans and conducted a damage control choreography through a network of aides and counsel. He spoke in measured statements to press liaisons that promised facts and assiduous clarification. But behind the public facade, something quivered. The articles had a metastasizing effect. They were not only about reputation anymore. They nudged the edges of truth into view, and the edges were unstable. Emily had learned how to brace herself against public opinion. She had not learned quite how to brace herself against Henry's way of making danger into a private wound. When she tried to speak for him at a gala, an awkward defense against the gathering whisper, he took her aside into the library where the books watched in solemn rows. "Don't," he said, with that low pressure that meant both care and command. "Don't defend me. Let me manage this." "Why can't I?" She had to force the words out, heat curling in her chest like steam.
"They'll tear me apart in less time than it takes to say my name. I won't be a prop in your silence." His jaw tightened. He looked as if someone had asked him a question about how he slept at night. "Because the problem is larger than what you can clarify in a lobby," he said. "Because this is not just reputation, this is leverage. People will try to use you as the easiest story." Leverage. It was a word she now knew as well as the price of a refill. There was an implication in it that felt like a hand at the throat. Her position, once a lifeline, was now being repurposed by forces she didn't control. Article 11 hummed like a second, ever-present voice. Speak and sever. Speak and be cut away. The strain did what strains do. It found the thinnest place and snapped. There was a night when a camera caught her laughing too loudly at a charity dinner, and someone edited the footage into a montage that read like a list of everything she had ever done wrong. The public liked tidy narratives, and Emily, like all women in tidy narratives, became either villain or victim. They'd handled worse, but this was different. This was not rumor alone. It was as if a dossier had been opened and cataloged every private misstep with the intent to make private life dangerous. She felt exposed in a way that no amount of scarves or consults could repair. That night in the study, a week after the new excerpt ran,
Everything they'd been containing finally expelled itself. He closed the study door with a deliberate hand. The house seemed to listen. "Why won't you let me speak?" she asked. Tears had come without permission and stung like a betrayal. It was foolish, she knew, to be surprised by her own body's small rebellions, but the weight of solitude had become an ache that ink could not fix. He looked at her then, the man's face carved into the discipline he lived in. "Because when you speak, the law interprets it," he said. He set his palms on the arms of his chair. "Because any admission, real or misinterpreted, becomes an instrument in someone's hand. Because Article 11 is not theater, Emily. It is architecture." "You think I don't understand that?" She spat the words not in anger as much as in the raw, flailing truth of someone who'd spent the night oscillating between rage and gratitude. "I signed a contract to save my mother's life. Do you think I don't feel the teeth of it the way you do?" He rose like someone about to remove his armor. For a breath, she saw the man not as myth or machine, but as a person with the same frayed seams. "I do not want you to be harmed," he said. "I do not want to watch them use you as a collateral." She stepped closer then, the movement both confession and petition. "I am not collateral," she said, each word a careful strike. "I am a person, someone who made a choice. And if I'm staying here to keep my mother's life safe, then I will not be silenced, so you can sanitize the story for them." The rage in her was a shock that made him still. There was an almost visible recalibration in his expression, a recognition that his protection had become a cage. He had made that cage to contain chaos, but he hadn't meant to lock her into it. They spoke long into a night that had no audience. The conversation was not tidy. It scraped across truth and bargain and the pathways people construct when fear of loss is the primary currency. He admitted, haltingly, that Catherine's words had stung not because they revealed facts, some of which were in certain lights incontrovertible, but because they were used as a lever. She admitted that she resented the way his protection made her small. They both said things that were sharp and then softened by the next breath. At the end of it, there was a surrender of sorts, not to action, but to recognition. He reached out and took her hand like he was making an oath. "If something happens," he said softly, "if the exploitation becomes dangerous to you, I will not let it keep you." She wanted to ask what he meant. Instead, she let herself lean for a moment, the way a person might lean into a promise, knowing promises are often porous things. Public life read the pair the way it always read other people, a sequence of images stitched into a narrative that left out 1,000 internal stitches. They moved through press obligations and private meetings with an awareness that any stumble could be weaponized. Yet in the quiet pockets, they were not just roles to one another. There were dinners where they sat without staff, where Henry let silence become companionable. There were drives where the city outside turned into a blur, and they spoke of books or trivialities, things that felt like reclamations. Then the rupture came in a place neither of them could have predicted. Joan fell ill again. Her health, for all the funds now in a trust and the private care that came with it, had always been capricious. This time it was sudden in a way that had the force of inevitability, an infection that settled in and refused to be hurried along. She was hospitalized in a private facility supported by the family. Sonogram, antibiotics, rooms with windows that took in the light as if it were another patient. Emily sat in the stiff fold-out chair beside the bed and watched monitors with the gravity of someone who had learned to understand numbers as weather. She had access to every resource that money could buy, but illness is a weather phenomenon indifferent to currency. She felt the need to be near, not as a beneficiary, but as a daughter who could not bear the thought of another test in another polite ledger. Henry appeared in the doorway as if pulled by a magnet. He did not announce himself. Joan looked up and smiled in a way that was both weary and grateful. Henry's hand reached for hers, an almost instinctive action that was less about claim and more about solidifying the room. he stayed. He sat in a chair and read aloud from a book Joan had started months ago and never finished. The rhythm of his voice had the effect of an anchor. The monitors kept their steady beeps like small shorebirds. In that tiny, shrine-like space, something old loosened. It was not theatrical. Henry's gaze when he looked at Henry's mother, he named her Eleanor when they were alone, was complicated, threaded with duty and a strange, pained tenderness. Emily watched him from the periphery of the bed like someone learning the outline of a stranger's face in a new light. When Joan's symptoms eased and physicians allowed her home, Emily felt a softness she hadn't expected, gratitude tethered to a cramped apprehension. Cared for and indebted, two states she knew intimately. The episode left them all exposed in a human way that tabloids could not fully render. It was Eleanor who then did something neither Emily nor Henry expected. She called Henry into the old family sitting room and did not coddle him. The woman who had at first been an obstacle in Emily's life, a matriarch who spoke with the iron clarity of someone who measured people in terms of usefulness, sat him down as if they were conducting a rehearsal he had been asked to perform poorly. "You are losing her," Eleanor said, not with accusation so much as with the bluntness of someone who had no patience for hesitance. She had seen their dance in the drawing rooms, and the way Silence now sat at their table like an extra guest. You think by containing everything you are protecting people. Sometimes you suffocate them. Henry bristled. Eleanor leaned forward, eye steady. You will not be the man who builds walls out of rules anymore. If you want her, fight for her. Not with money and maneuvers, but with the thing you have been most afraid to use, honesty. It was a message that spoke to his most private architecture. Henry left that conversation with an awareness that felt like a fracture in his old pattern. The recognition that his life had been a continuous act of containment, and containment was now a liability. Eleanor, in that moment, had done what few had. She forced him to see that his rules had been the thing that nearly drove people away. He sought Emily in the late hour, finding her on the rooftop terrace where city light stitched the horizon. Her hair had been hastily thrown up. She looked smaller out there with the wind, as if weather could remind you of scale. "Come with me," he said, and this time it wasn't a question about appearances or obligations. The plane ticket she had once been offered sat in his hand, but the offer was different now. Not for a contract, not for an image, for a place to breathe. He spoke then with a clarity that was not entirely free of fear, but it was genuine. "I'm going to set up an irrevocable trust for Joan. It will be funded, guaranteed. You will never have to worry about her care again because of me." The pawn's slow rhythm in his voice didn't mask the humility of what he was doing. It was an offering that did not demand her continued presence in his life in return. He could have, would have, used many other means or kept strings attached. Instead, he made a clean, radical thing, an unconditional gift. "I will give you freedom," he continued. "Pick a place. Go anywhere. The papers will be posted into the trust and transferred. If you choose to leave, I will not try to keep you. I will not say it's best if you stay. I will only say what I mean, that you are not a piece in a ledger." Emily's throat tightened. It was the kind of vulnerability Henry rarely allowed himself, an abdication masquerading as generosity. The plane ticket in his hand was real, the envelope already thick with what a counselor would call securing funds. It smelled faintly of the leather of his wallet, the invisible currency of his world. "I don't want to be bought," she said, because the words were necessary. She had been given money before in her life as an anesthetizing solution. "I don't want to be charged anything. I don't want a test to determine whether I stay." He looked as if he had been prepared for calculus, but not for poetry. Then he surprised her by the way he lowered himself to the bench and put the ticket on the table between them, not as a bargaining chip, but as an option. "This is not about buying you," he said carefully. "This is making a choice easy. If your choice is to go, do it freely. If your choice is to stay, do it because you want to, not because you fear something will happen." The thing about that night was not that it was cinematic. It was pedestrian in the most devastating way. There was a plane ticket, there was legal paperwork being prepared, there was privacy arranged, and a transfer of funds. There was also a man who had found a way to hand another person an exit and a home. And that act of handing over uncoerced freedom felt like surrender and entreaty at once. Emily left the ticket on the bench. She did not take it. She could have, and in another life she might have. She folded her hands in her lap and thought about all the small ways people profess loyalty, through service, through sacrifice, through staying. She had already signed legal agreements born of necessity. She wanted this to be different. "I will not decide on a plane ticket at midnight," she said. "But I will say this. You cannot keep building walls and then be surprised when people can't live inside them. If you're offering me the world, offer me the world with the expectation that I might take it, and the expectation that you'll be with me if I do." For the first time, he looked uncertain in a way that was not the tremor of calculation, but the tremor of possibility. He reached for her hand and held it without haste. "I will try," he said, and the sentence, in its brevity, was more profound than many of his long explanations. She stayed. But staying wasn't a single act. It was a series of agreements, ruptures, time. They made a new set of papers, more honest in their way. Article 11 remained, because Henry, pragmatic and practiced, could not entirely unravel the protective cage he'd built. Yet the amendment they negotiated gave them a buffer. Mediation would be required. Confessions would be documented and then given a cooling period. The trust that safeguarded Chaulin's care would remain intact even in the face of emotional rupture. It was not a perfect compromise. It was a real one. For months after, life smoothed into a pattern that had the texture of a careful experiment. They argued, they laughed, they sat in enough unspectacular silence to learn its shape. Henry learned to expect vulnerability rather than engineer it away. Emily learned not to mistake protection for possession. The house itself took on a slower rhythm, one that allowed for small morning rituals, coffee ground in a particular way, a bowl of fruit on the kitchen table that was never quite matched to the house's grandeur. When Henry asked her to marry him properly, it wasn't on a stage or in front of cameras. It was a rooftop in the month when the air felt like clarity, when the sky above the city was a clean blue and the night below had the hum of careful lights. He had arranged little things that read like personal investments. Familiar songs on a playlist that had no business being curated for weddings, a small flourish of lights that flirted with the evening, and a dinner that felt like the private promise of a meal between two people who had learned one another's faintest needs. He knelt with a simplicity that made the gathered world irrelevant. He produced a small box, the kind that wasn't photographed because its jewelry could be large enough for headlines, but here it was merely an object. "Emily," he said, and unlike other times, his sentences were not rehearsed. They were stumbles and truths. "I am not good at this in the abstract. I build walls to keep weather out and end up keeping warmth out as well. But I want to be intentionally bad at controlling every outcome if it means being with you. Will you marry me? Not for the press, not for the ledger, for real, for all the messy days." Her yes was not an exhalation. It was a decision that rearranged the landscape of both of their lives. When she said yes, the city around them seemed to acknowledge the choice, as if the buildings themselves softened. He slid the ring onto her finger with a tenderness that bordered on worship. It was not theatrical. It was domestic and reverent. They married in a small ceremony that had only close friends and a handful of family. Eleanor stood at his side and watched as if unraveling a proof she had written for herself. The photographer, one who had spent months following their public life, was present but unobtrusive. The vows they exchanged were not rhetorical flourishes, but precise, compass-like statements of intention. Henry spoke of keeping her safe in ways that were not about controlling outcomes. Emily spoke of choosing, every day, to meet him halfway between their two histories. After the ceremony, in a corner of the venue where paper napkins had once been left as invitations, Henry produced a pen and a spare napkin. He tore it from a stack with a kind of theatrical casualness that nevertheless felt loaded. The napkin had moved through the years as a symbol in their house, once a servant of PR, once a blotting paper for small tears, now a surface for declaration. He wrote slowly, as if the act of committing ink to cellulose was in itself an act of defiance against all the signed papers and clauses that had boxed them in. The handwriting was not the anonymous shorthand he'd used at first. It was deliberate. He handed the napkin to Emily. She read the sentence once, and then again, and the words felt like a promise turned into a rule of engagement for two people who had learned to be truthful in ways that wounded and healed. Break each other's hearts with love daily. There was a humor in it, a daring, almost flinty tenderness, yet its truth was sharp. Love, in their world, could hurt. It might fail them. But to promise, performatively and daily, to choose one another despite inevitable pain was the real work of marriage. She laughed, wet and incredulous and happy, and the laugh sounded like proof. They signed other papers that afternoon, less lifelines and more being for real documents. The trust remained, restructured but irrevocable for Joan's security. Article 11, the clause that had haunted them like a metronome, was now a relic, present but tempered by the mutual understanding they had accepted and the mediation route they had agreed upon. The wedding was small. The party afterward was not free of eyes, but the eyes at that table mattered in a different way. Eleanor danced once, and then sat, hands folded, content. Henry's old associates came and left like ghosts dressed in winter suits. The social world remained, but it carried less of its earlier threat. The tablecloth smelled faintly of lemon. The music thinned into night. Months later, the house had the hum of domestic life. Joan's breathing improved until it was not blissful, but ordinary. Emily found herself making soup without thinking of receipts. There were simple mornings when Henry stood at the sink and washed a plate because she had been up late and the world was practical in its small requests. The touch of his hand in the small quotidian places, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear while they loaded a dishwasher, took on the weight of rituals. He called her, sometimes, M in private, and the contraction of her name into intimacy was like a small private theft. They had arguments, not infrequent and never easy, about control and transparency and the degree to which the past could be made irrelevant by a ring. They navigated them as adults, mediation when things were severe, apologies when things were petty, and a slow habituation to the idea of asking and being asked for forgiveness. One morning, months into the marriage and the private life it brought, Emily found a napkin left on the little kitchen table where they drank coffee. The handwriting this time was hers. She had picked up a pen to jot down a grocery list and realized, mid-loop, that what she wanted to write was not milk and bread, but something more real, a small, absurd pledge to the person across from her. She stole Henry's pen and wrote, in a flourish she had not known she owned, "Today I choose you again." When he read it, his face, usually composed like the surface of a calm lake, rippled in a way that made her look twice. They had both been changed, not by one monumental gesture, but 1,000 small choices and a handful of large ones. Their world remained complicated. Eleanor's presence still meant that family expectations threaded through their decisions. Catherine Sterling's name would, doubtless, always hover somewhere like a weather pattern. But the scale had shifted. Money could not fix integrity, but it could buy a measure of peace. More than that, the work that had been done inside both of them, Henry learning risk as an intimacy, Emily learning that staying was not always surrender, had deepened their bond. In the quiet of a Sunday afternoon, Emily sat on the terrace with Joan and watched Henry show his mother how to use a new kettle. The three of them moved around each other like people who had learned a new choreography,
easy, familiar, alive. When Henry looked up and caught Emily's eye, he raised his hand in a small wave. No show, no performative flourish, just a private signal. Emily raised her own hand back and felt the world settle. There would be days of strain in the future. There would always be such days. But there would also be these moments. Coffee sipped on mismatched cups, a napkin folded into a promise, a ring warmed by a hand that had learned to hold rather than to arrange. They had stepped from the edge of a life formed of bargains into a cohabitation of chosen risk, and the choice, each day, was its own kind of miracle. If you liked this enemies to lovers journey with impossible stakes and tender reversals, hit subscribe and stay for the next story. Would you have signed the contract to save a loved one? Tell us in the comments. Would you stay or would you go?